Chapter 4: The Story of Atlantis. Doubtless all my readers will have read something about Atlantis, the fabled continent of antiquity which lies beneath the waters of the Atlantic, the site of the Osiris being the highest peak of the sunken continent, which lies beneath the waters of the Atlantic, the site of the Osiris being the highest peak of the sunken continent. This continent was the subject of messages dictated to me by the voice in which the story of the moral decay and physical destruction of Atlantis were described. Now, I do not wish to discuss in these pages whether the story of Atlantis given here is right or not. All I propose to do is to write down what the voice told me. Whether you believe it or not depends upon yourself. Though I think you will agree, if a planchette could write a poem that was going to appear 3 weeks later in a newspaper, there is no reason why a voice could not speak from the past days of Atlantis. In the case of the planchette, the writer was probably some departed spirit, still within the magnetism of Earth, whereas the voice is a highly evolved spiritual being, having considerable control over the waves of thought and is therefore able to transmit to me inspirational messages. At any rate, here is the story as it is dictated to me by the voice. In the great days of Atlantis, before the coming of the great flood, which was the final punishment meted out to those evil ones, all men lived at peace with one another. The continent was divided into 3 sections, partly on account of its geographical nature and partly because of the degree of Ptah. It was immediately before the destruction of that evil continent called Sargon, or Lemuria, that my father Ptah did collect together those divine sparks who were to escape the destruction which finally swept Sargon away. They were to restart life in Atlantis, which was at that time ripe to receive the evolving life of the world called Earth. This I have told you in the book of truth, which has already been given unto you, my children. The divine men and women, footnote 1, son daughters of God, not to be confused with the divine sparks of God's overplus, lived and mixed with the sons and daughters of Yeva. Footnote 2, divine sparks incarnated in mortal bodies by Yeva and Uranus in Lemuria. And they were as teachers to their less evolved brothers of earth. All was according to the word of my father Ptah, which had been given unto him by the blessed Cosmos. My father chose from amongst the divine ray children 24 son-daughters who were to help him in his plan for the evolving of divine sparks. Temples were built and places of worship were inaugurated, having as their visible sign the disk of the living sun, of whom the Lord is Horus Atanu, he acting as the mediator between the men of earth and the Father, Mother, Son, God. These temples were built of a white, shining stone, which was very durable. They consisted of the outer core of the priests and teachers, and the 3 subterranean chambers, which were the same in character as those built at a later date in Khemu, footnote 1, Egypt, and referred to in the Book of Truth. 24 of these temples were built, 1 chief cathedral of initiation in the sacred heights, and the remainder in the tablelands and the lowlands. Over each temple was placed one of the 24 initiates, or ray children, whom I have already mentioned as being chosen by my father Ptah for the execution of his will. I would here give you a short explanation as to the actual relative positions held by my father's teachers, whom he had chosen, and I would also define exactly the position held by my father Ptah el Dawood and his actual manifestations to the people. The time that I now speak of, my beloved children, is that great and glorious period, footnote 2, known as the Golden Age, before the times of bitter hate and tribulation which came later, because these men had brought it upon themselves. For a moment I will take you to the continent of Zarkon. This evil place had been entirely destroyed according to the word of the cosmos manifested through the medium of El Daoud and his twin and spouse eternal, who is El Daouda, the same whom I have called Ivam in my book of truth. The actual disintegration of that great continent was over a period of many thousands of years of Earth's time, and was accomplished as the outcome of a series of volcanic disturbances which gradually undermined the substrata comprising the foundations of that continent. Footnote 3. Electromagnetic waves of evil first caused chaotic weather conditions, the atmosphere being more susceptible than the grosser earth. Then penetrating the earth, they accumulated and caused terrestrial upheavals. The disaster was brought about on account of the satanic domination exercised by Uranus. Footnote 4. Called Satanicu after the first fall of Lemuria, and known to later generations as the devil and his followers. Black magic was rife, and the chances of those who still remained steadfast to the cause of divine evolution were almost hopeless. The final great upheaval was caused by an immense crater or fissure about 3 miles in circumference being rent in the center of the continent. From this fissure, suffocating gases were poured into the atmosphere, and being of a heavy nature, these gases hung low over the continent, spreading out in all directions, and so that before the submersion actually took place, the entire life of the continent was obliterated. During previous periods, all those who were to be collected in Atlantis had been ordered to proceed to that continent. Having described to you briefly the destruction of Sarkon, I shall proceed with the state of evolution in Atlantis. During the last years of life in Sarkon, my father had been preparing the continent of Atlantis to receive the life of the world, for he had been plainly told by the cosmos that Sarkon must be obliterated. His first care was the organization of the crown of Atlantis. This was the cathedral, which was built at his commands in the sacred heights. I shall give a brief description of it as follows. It was situated in the heart of the high mountains beyond the tablelands, and was inaccessible to those who knew not the power of levitation. It was surrounded by 7 great peaks, which represented the 7 pillars of the universe, and in the center thereof nestled this great house of initiation, the only visible sign being the head and front paws of a gigantic sphinx which guarded the eastern entrance. Between the paws of the sphinx was an immense iron door, through which, when opened, force could be directed downward upon the tablelands, where the uninitiated population was ordered to gather for worship every so often during the year. The main structure, which was above ground and situated in the basin formed by the 7 peaks, was connected with the Sphinx by a tunnel, which was about 100 yards in length and semicircular in section. The structure itself was all built of a white stone found in Atlantis, and used because of its absolute durability and resistance to the action of the elements. It was round when viewed generally, but in reality it had 24 sides, and was surrounded by pillars placed at each angle formed by the junction of the walls. The ceiling was slightly dome-shaped, although at first sight it had the appearance of being flat. Upon the very center of this dome was the disk of the living son of Horus Atanu, and it was depicted as having 7 hands, reaching out therefrom towards the solar universe. This symbol represented the sun radiating vital force from the fountainhead of the cosmos, which dwells within the circle of the conscious universe. To return to the interior of this chamber, which was really a huge circular-shaped temple, I shall describe for you, my children, the ornamentation and furniture which comprised the interior. In the center of the floor, which was of marble, was a gigantic pattern of the sun's disk, with the 7 hands reaching out, and in the very center of this sun was the head of Ptah el Dauda, and they were represented in the form of a sphinx. Remember, my children, that this was not symbolizing Ptah as a deity who was to be worshipped. It only symbolized him as the Father King initiate, whilst his complete functions I have already explained to you in my Book of Truth. The altar, or table of initiation, was placed against the east wall of this 24-sided chamber and was of cedar wood, which was a common product of the highlands of Atlantis. The symbols upon it were as follows. The front had engraven upon it the symbol of the world called Earth, which was enclosed within a heart. Upon the top of this world was a cup-shaped flower, out of the center of which watched the all-seeing eye of the inner circle of the cosmic mysteries. And from out at the very top of the symbol were 4 great strands or rays of vitality emanating from the eye and symbolizing the flow of vitality, knowledge, and love to the conscious universe. This whole symbol represented the trinity of the cosmic force. Upon the altar's top were various chalices and cups for the drinking of the juice of the orange and the breaking of the bread, which were used at the communions of remembrance. These vessels and plates need not be described unto you, my children, as they will not be important, except for you to know that they were there. This chamber, being the outward and visible edifice, was used by the initiates and helpers who had been chosen from amongst the Ray children by my father Ptah. All matters of administration and legislation were drawn up in this chamber. It was also used as a chamber of worship when occasion so required.